Hello, everyone. My name is Nika Baswell, and I'm a Senior Project Manager at the Center for Universal Education at the Brookings Institution. I have the privilege of welcoming you today for our session on how to scale your innovation, lessons from Rosie. I'm sure you're aware of all these reminders, but I'm sharing a few tips on how to use Zoom at our webinar today. To begin, we will have simultaneous interpretation available in English, French, and Spanish. And to use it, you can click the interpretation globe icon at the bottom of your screen. It should be there right now, and you may select your language. For questions, you will find on the toolbar when you hover over the bottom of your screen, you will see a Q&A button. You will not see the chat function, which may be familiar to most Zoom users, and instead we will be reviewing and responding to written questions via the Q&A function. Please note that we will not use the raise hand function today. To post a question, click on this Q&A function and write your question. Please note that the questions will only be seen by hosts and panelists, and this will allow us to select a few questions to answer during the session, which we'll read aloud during the Q&A sections of our agenda, or we will type a direct response to you. Since we have limited time, we unfortunately won't be able to get to everyone's question, but we will review all the questions after the session, and if we notice any common themes or questions that we did not have time to address, we will follow up. So thank you, and I look forward to this event. I will now pass it over to Brahima Bali, Vice President and Director of the Global Economy and Development Program here at Brookings Institution. Kul, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you, Nika, and good morning or good afternoon, everyone. As Nika said, my name is Brahima Kulibali. I'm the Vice President of the Global Economy and Development Program. And it gives me great pleasure to welcome you to discuss here the effective scaling of educational innovation globally, particularly in low and middle income country context. Since 2014, our Center for Universal Education's Million Learnings project has been working to understand why exciting education innovation often fail to lead to large-scale systemic change. Over the past decade, interest in the field has grown, with a focus on impact that goes beyond simply introducing promising educational innovations. It's about integrating these innovations thoughtfully to ensure that they grow, have depth, and importantly, create lasting impact in diverse educational settings. It is in 2020 that the Center for Universal Education joined the Knowledge and Innovation Exchange, a collaborative effort between the Global Partnership for Education and IDRC. This collaboration gave birth to what we call ROSIE, an acronym that stands for the Research on Scaling the Impact of Innovation in Education. ROSIE is a multi-team, cross-national research and support initiative focused on scaling education innovation in low and middle income countries around the world. So today, my colleagues are excited to share findings and recommendations from the ROSIE-KIX initiative, the result of 3 years of research, collaborative work, and collective learning. We will begin with a presentation about scaling and some of what ROSIE has learned to date. Then we'll have 2 panel discussions. The first is on what works in scaling, and the second on maximizing data and research in government decision-making. We hope that today's event will challenge some conventional perspectives, emphasize the importance of careful collaboration, and bring attention to how system-level dynamics influence work of scaling impact in education. I would like now to introduce our first presenter, a senior fellow at the Global Economy and Development Center for Universal Education, Brad Olson. Brad, the floor is yours.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much. I'm going to share my screen. Great. On behalf of CUE, it's my pleasure to welcome you to today's event. Nika welcomed you. Kul has welcomed you. I'd like to welcome you as well. I also want to thank the International Development Research Center for their generous support of CUE, which helps make the work that we do possible. And I want to reiterate Brookings's commitment to independence and underscore that the views expressed today are solely those of the speakers. Also, although I might be the primary spokesperson for this work today, it doesn't mean that ROSIE is not a collaborative effort. First and foremost, I'd like to credit all 15 KIX ROSIE scaling teams. I'll tell you more about them later, but we learned so much from these ROSIE teams, and I think that all of us in ROSIE together have learned so much. Their tireless work on behalf of children and youth, communities, teachers and families in their locations is exceedingly impressive. They're real heroes. And I also want to thank the Millions Learning team here at the Center for Universal Education, who has been leading ROSIE with me. Nika Baswell, Maya Elliott, Tracy Olson, Monica Rodriguez, Molly Weiss, and others have worked very hard on ROSIE, and I'm grateful for their efforts. Talking through the terminology around scaling isn't only about contextualizing today's event and establishing maybe a modicum of collective clarity, but it also allows me to say a few things about scaling. Scaling is incredibly important because while there are many attempts to address low learning outcomes around the world, many of these efforts abide by a short-term project mindset. They have limited funding. There's a focus on proof of concept pilots. And as a result, many promising innovations suddenly end or fade away or become pilots to nowhere. As a result, scaling has become an unpopular way to embed a new practice or program into the daily lives of an education location so that it becomes the new normal and is sustained. And so essentially, we think about scaling in that way. What does it mean to carefully and thoughtfully embed a promising innovation so that it lasts the test of time? Cynthia Coburn suggests that scaling is not replication, but spreading ownership. Paul Carlisle writes that he hopes we've moved past mere transfer, where you cut and paste an innovation into a new location, and that maybe we've even moved past the notion of translation, where we might offer surface translations of an innovation for a new location, but instead we can see scaling as actual transformation. This is a way in which a promising innovation is brought to a location, and the end users, the families, the teachers, the children, the youth, are able to engage in and transform the innovation as they embed it into their systems and their daily life, at the same time that the innovation transforms for the better the work and the system in the location. This kind of mutual adaptation is the goal for scaling. ROSIE is an acronym for Research on Scaling the Impact of Innovations in Education, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. And then I'd like to talk some about what ROSIE has been learning together over these years. I am having trouble. There we go. When we talk about scaling, we're talking about a range of approaches. There are multiple ways to scale an innovation, and we're really focused on scaling impact, not scaling the innovation itself. Scaling the innovation, in other words, increasing the reach or the size of the innovation, might be a wonderful means to the end of scaling impact, but the focus always needs to be on the impact, the results of the innovation that can actually have an effect on the people in the location. And so if the focus isn't always on the impact, if it ends up being shifted to scaling the innovation, then we might lose sight of what really matters. It's not the innovation that matters as an end goal. In some ways, scaling the innovation is almost like the delivery device for scaling impact. In thinking about it this way, ROSIE takes a systems approach. We understand that growing a project or program isn't the goal, but creating a way so that the impact of the program is embedded inside the whole system. That raises the question, what's an education innovation? We think of an innovation as an idea or approach or a program or a technology, something that is able to bring change. It doesn't have to be new to the world. Instead, it can be new to the setting. We might think about small innovations or micro innovations, medium size and macro ones. Micro innovations are those kinds of innovations typically focused on problems of practice in the classroom or the learning setting, maybe a digital device for literacy, maybe a new way of teaching algebra. Mid-size innovations are a little bit broader or deeper in scope and reach. For example, maybe offering free breakfast to all students in a particular location. And macro innovations are bold and or big, maybe switching an entire location to multi-age classrooms or offering free secondary education in a whole country. I'm not entirely sure why this is not advancing. When we think about scaling in ROSIE, as I mentioned, it's a little bit different from project implementation. For a long time, there was a notion that rolling out a new innovation was a simple technical linear process. We now realize it's very complex, it's nonlinear, and it's about impact, as I've mentioned, more than reach. There's a popular notion these days, which is education transfer, which is that it's become increasingly popular for education innovations to be passed around, imported and exported across locations or across countries. This is about things like best buys and global practices. And in some ways, it's a valuable way to build on research and things that have worked in other locations. But it also carries with it an awful lot of complexity. Because something works in one location doesn't necessarily mean that it works in another location. And so the act of taking a pre-existing innovation and embedding it into a new location, what we call contextualization, matters. There are surface dimensions of contextualization. There are deeper dimensions of contextualization. There are equity dimensions of contextualization. And as I'm going to talk about a little bit later, as we increase the popularity of education transfer, we need to increase the prioritization of contextualization. The other thing I want to say about this is systems thinking. As I mentioned, we at ROSIE conceive of scaling through a systems lens. And if you see these concentric circles on the right side of the screen, I think that means two things. One of them is that if an innovation doesn't reach the instructional core, in other words, that location where learners and educators are engaging and interacting with each other around learning, teachers or students or mentors or families. If it doesn't get to the instructional core, I don't think that the innovation is working at all. As Leonard Garnier, who is a panelist on our session, said recently, if an innovation doesn't get to the instructional core, it doesn't exist. Dick Elmore has made a whole career about that. So I think that's an incredibly important thing. No matter where the innovation comes in at its system level, it had better have an effect at the instructional core. The other thing to think about with systems thinking is this notion that there are multiple system levels and there are multiple system parts, and all of them are having an influence on the innovation and the scaling of impact of the innovation. And if people aren't thinking about this interdependency of the whole ecosystem of a location, they're going to miscalculate, they're going to misunderstand the way in which the broader environment will affect the scaling. We've learned that there are many promising education scaling models that do not succeed because they miscalculated aspects of this broader environment. I also think in this day and age, we cannot talk about scaling without talking about equity. And one of the things that we've found is that equity considerations are diminished when equity is seen as a standalone topic or just a single dimension of the work. Instead, we think that equity is woven through every aspect of scaling. It's almost like a ribbon that weaves through all of the trees of a forest. We can think about equity considerations within scaling in 4 different dimensions. One of them is the innovation itself may be designed with equity in mind. A second dimension is the actual scaling work may prioritize equity considerations. In other words, as the scaling proceeds, what kinds of differential equity results flow and ebb over time. Some equity considerations may increase, others may decrease. Thirdly, when an innovation that's worked in one place is being contextualized in a new location, equity has to be rethought. Equity is always context dependent. And so what kinds of dimensions around equity in one location don't always have the same meaning in another location. And then fourth, as researchers are engaged in the work alongside their scaling to better understand how their scaling is having effects on various subpopulations and what kind of adaptations need to be made during the scaling process, we think it's incredibly important to prioritize equity. That means collecting data on subpopulations. It means engaging in equity-based research. It means using research on equity in scaling in order to increase the visibility of equity as an important transversal topic. So what is ROSIE? ROSIE began in 2020. ROSIE is part of the Knowledge and Innovation Exchange, or KIX, which is a joint endeavor between the Global Partnership for Education and the International Development Research Center. The KIX initiative is this broad ecosystem, and it's got multiple parts to it. One part is ROSIE, and ROSIE is designed to have three interlocking parts. Through a series of processes in 2020, we invited 15 of the more or less 40 KIX scaling grantee teams to join ROSIE, and they've been a part of ROSIE ever since. We established a professional learning community where we engage in peer learning and peer exchange, and we pool resources and we work to learn from and alongside each other. At the same time, there's an action research project where we together developed some common learning questions. These are things that all of us wanted to learn about our own scaling processes and about scaling writ large. And because KIX focuses not only on scaling, but importantly on research on scaling, we made sure that this action research project existed as a way for the 15 KIX scaling teams to regularly share their data and their information with us. We coded it and analyzed it and fed it back to them in a way that we thought would be useful to their ongoing work, as well as creating events and tools and reports for the KIX ecosystem and the larger scaling community more globally. And then finally, the third aspect of ROSIE is an ongoing complementary qualitative study in which we have been seeking to better understand how government decision makers go about the work of engaging, of identifying and adopting and adapting and supporting innovations for scale. Who is ROSIE? 15 teams, each of which has a promising education innovation that it's seeking to embed in one or more country. You can see that there are 13 countries in low and middle income parts of the world, and each of these ROSIE teams is engaged in work in one or more of those. The ROSIE innovations exist within learning or teaching tools, teacher professional development innovations, education management systems, and learning assessment tools. They take multiple pathways and there are multiple scaling goals, although it's worth saying that institutionalization is a common scaling goal. What we mean by that is that many of these teams have as their primary scaling goal a desire to partner with government and then ultimately integrate the innovation inside the government system, essentially working with government to hand the innovation over so that government will ultimately take responsibility for supporting and delivering and maintaining it. We've had 37 events. We've got over 3,000 pieces of coded data. We've created over 25 events and publications and podcasts and tools and blogs. And we've found an awful lot of things. In the interest of time, I'm going to go through these rather quickly. But one thing that we found is that during the COVID pandemic, teams had to adapt very quickly. Those adaptations were oftentimes very successful. They also carried knock-on effects. In other words, the adaptation created other incidental changes in the scaling process. And we learned that if ROSIE teams aren't being careful about looking for and collecting data on those knock-on effects, they might miss some of the wonderful incidental benefits of their adaptations, or they might miss opportunities to mitigate some of the challenges that come out of this. We learned that the terminology matters. We've learned that there is real value to engaging teachers and school leaders as active partners in scaling and not just beneficiaries of scaling. We can talk a little bit later about incentives and the importance of not believing that we can short-term think our way into lasting impact. There's a fair amount we can say about government decision-making, which turns out not to be particularly linear or bureaucratic or straightforward as many people think, but is this complex process of negotiation in which national politics, global funding partners, the rise of ed tech, and complexities around data use actually shape the landscape within which decision makers are doing their work. We realize that scaling is an adaptive art as much as a technical science. We think that until equity is actually incentivized, it's going to be hard to prioritize it in the actual work of scaling. We believe that there's an awful lot of potential, and these ROSIE teams have done a really impressive job around thinking early and clearly about how to engage the right champions in their scaling work. We'll talk more about that. There are an awful lot of challenges to collecting and using data, especially when it comes to data around equity. We want to make sure that what doesn't get lost in the process is that there are many homegrown innovations that emerged organically from locations, and those have grassroots support already built in. They oftentimes have inherent equity considerations, and we don't want those to get lost inside the popularity of education transfer. And then we also think there's a lot to say about integrating scaling with systems change. It's a work in progress. It's taken us years to get to where we are now. We are doing some things well, other things not so well, but we continue to learn from the work. Great. Thank you very much. We're now going to turn to the panels. We have two panels, as Cool has mentioned. The first panel is going to be moderated by Jenny Perlman Robinson, a mentor and my predecessor, and someone who's just been wonderful around this work, and I'm pleased to hand this off to her in just a moment. And then secondly, we'll have another panel that I'll moderate. Thank you very much. We can begin the videos now.
My name is Catherine Fulgens. During the scaling of our innovation, school-based in service data training, we collaborated with research institutions, policymakers at the national level, and teacher colleges to empower various stakeholders, particularly pre-service tutors and local government officials. The team capacitated teachers to pilot the innovation, provided mentorship and support, and monitored its implementation at the school level. The scaling process was therefore successful as the innovation addressed the challenges faced by teachers in teaching mathematics, particularly the negative attitudes of students towards the subject. Through the scaling process, teachers were able to relate mathematics concepts and real-life applications. As a result, a positive relationship has been established among teachers, students, and local government officials. Students now find joy in learning mathematics by relating it to real-world objects and are even encouraging teachers in other subjects to embrace the innovation. And so through these engagements, we are learning that the scaling was successful and it worked across the countries, Tanzania, Kenya, and Zambia, and we are seeing a lot of improvements considering the contextual environment. Thank you.
Mi nombre es Diego Vázquez Bruce. Lo que ha funcionado muy bien en nuestro proyecto es una combinación de tres elementos. Primero, teníamos un punto focal en el Ministerio de Educación que nos proporcionaba acceso directo a las autoridades para discutir cualquier problema y cualquier aspecto en que necesitáramos alinear el proyecto con las necesidades de las autoridades educativas. Segundo, teníamos un coordinador nacional con una gran reputación y conocimiento del contexto local que nos servía como la figura representativa. Y tercero, y crítico, teníamos una junta de monitoreo evaluación y aprendizaje integrada por diversos actores del ecosistema educativo, docentes, familias y autoridades, que nos permitía tener no solo la difusión inmediata de los resultados del proyecto, sino también codiseñar estrategias de adaptación a cambios en el contexto y estrategias de escalamiento.
My name is Anna Sawaki. I'm the Director of Programs and Partnership. One thing that worked very well with our scaling is our collaboration with the government, where through this collaboration, we were able to form the Scaling Advisory Committee, which brought together members of the government and non-government stakeholders. And throughout the implementation of this committee, members of the committee had an opportunity to come together to co-design and co-implement the research which we were looking at elements of our youth-led mentorship model, how best they fit into the government priorities, and how can we work together to scale it to the non-CAMFED partner schools. And all the time, the members of the committee were able to learn, advise, and provide some insights of how best we can work with the system to make sure that this best practice, this best model can reach out to more students. And we are saying this as seeing this as the best model because as we move forward to scale to the other districts, we see some differences on how the government is taking ownership of the program. It's now not about CAMFED, rather the government taking lead to make sure that this program is reaching out to more students by providing, selecting the youth to participate in the program, selecting the teachers to oversee the program, selecting the schools themselves, providing facilities. And to us, that's a new trajectory. It doesn't look like we are expanding to new district or schools, but rather the government is taking ownership to make sure that this proven model is reaching more students and making sure that they learn, thrive, and transit to other pathways of life. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Wongai from World Vision Canada. One of our most significant successes lies in forming long-term trust-based relationships with both national and community decision makers who are critical for scaling our innovation. Our research project was anchored by a robust action plan for knowledge mobilization involving a high dose of relational, iterative, and context-sensitive processes of moving knowledge to action. We are engaged in ongoing, impactful discussions on scaling our innovation, and we've seen positive progress. However, we still need more time to have a better sense of the long-term impact and influence of these efforts and data on government policies and practices. Yet, this process is not without its challenges. We've had a fair share of those, particularly regarding structural shifts in the government precipitated by electoral changes or other unforeseen factors. Such transitions disrupted and may likely disrupt established connections and necessitate a re-engagement process with new office bearers. We found ourselves having to essentially start anew, rebuilding relationships and reaffirming the relevance of our data. We've learned that agility is very important, and the need to maintain continuous engagement, strategies that transcend individual tenures in office. Additionally, we've also learned that building relationships is crucial, and partnering with local think tanks and academia adds credibility to the research. It is then equally important to cultivate an understanding of data across these partnerships and its implications across all levels of government. This includes identifying what aspects of innovations are easier to scale, what optimal scaling level is, and what the cost would be.
Hi, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you might be. Thank you so much, Brad, for that excellent overview and that incredibly warm welcome. I am Jenny Perlman Robinson, a non-resident senior fellow here at Brookings, and it's an absolute pleasure to be here today. I will ask my panelists to please join us by turning on their videos as well. I had the absolute privilege to be part of the team as KIX and ROSIE were just launching, I guess, about 4 years ago now. And it's really just wonderful to be back here and really having an opportunity to hear about the rich insights and collaborative learning that has happened over the past 3 and 4 years. So as Brad said, this first panel will focus on this question of what is working in scaling the impact of education innovations in low and middle income countries, as well as the question of how is it working? How is large scale change happening? We just heard some great insights from 4 of the ROSIE scaling teams. And we'll have an opportunity in a moment as well to hear some of the thoughts and perspective from 3 distinguished panelists who are joining us today. So let me begin, please, by introducing our panelists. And just to make sure that the videos are on and they have joined us. I don't see them on my screen, but I'm going to trust that they are all here. Great. Wonderful. So we are so fortunate to have these 3 individuals with us. They represent a policymaker, a researcher, and a funder, but those descriptions are way too simplistic as they wear multiple hats. We have Leonardo Garnier, who is a special advisor to the UN Secretary General on transforming education. Luis Crouch, who is Emeritus Senior Economist with RTI International. And Trisha Wind, who is the Program Leader with GPE Knowledge and Innovation Exchange at the International Development Research Center in Canada. So I have the opportunity to engage in a conversation with the panelists for the next 10, 12 minutes or so before opening it up to you all for any questions that you might have. To ask a question, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and your questions will only be seen by the hosts and the panelists. The team will select a few questions to pose during the Q&A session. And then other questions and themes that arise, we'll make sure to respond with and share with the audience after the event. As a reminder, we have simultaneous interpretation in English, Spanish, and French. So please be sure to select your language, clicking on the globe icon at the bottom of your screen. So without further ado, I see my panelists here with us. That's wonderful. Let's get started. I'm going to open up by asking you all the same question. And I think I'll first pose it to you, Leonardo, and then ask you, Luis, to chime in, and then Trisha, if you wouldn't mind as well. As we heard from the 4 scaling teams in the video, as well as Brad shared, having the right combination and mix of people involved in one's scaling efforts appears to be a real critical ingredient. We might refer to these people as scaling partners or scaling champions. So given your experience and your perspectives, what kind of people do you believe are essential to include in a scaling approach? And any insights as to how best to engage them? So Leonardo, can I turn it over to you?
Yes, thank you. I'll try to speak not as a special advisor to the UN Secretary General, but rather as a former Minister of Education, because it's more to the point here on how to scale up projects. I like very much your emphasis on scaling impact. There are so many pilot projects that never go beyond that, precisely because they don't ask the questions you're asking. I think it is essential first to to identify a relevant problem and to build a shared narrative so that it is shared by the different sectors of the educational community. But in specific with respect to your question, I think that what is critical is to understand that you need to involve people at the different levels of government. Of course, you need champions at the highest level of government. If you have the heads of state interested, of course, if you have the ministers of education or related fields convinced that this is a significant program that should be scaled up, that is critical. But I think you need to identify leaders not just at the political level, but also at the technical, at the directorial level of the institutions. You have to identify not just the leaders or who will be your champions. You have to be very dedicated also to identify the sources of resistance. Who are those persons or parts of the institutions that will likely oppose, fear, or be indifferent to the project, and then develop a strategy how to win them over or to neutralize them. And in terms of the government, there is a very difficult balance, because you want the government and the authorities to be in love with the project and to be their champions. However, there is a risk that if they own it very much, not just as national authorities, but even in a partisan way, governments change. Something that Brad said is you have to be wary of the political cycle. So if one project is very much felt in a country like belonging to a political party or to a specific minister, then the chances of continuity are lower. So this balance between convincing current authorities to champion it, but to champion it as a national transformation, not as their personal or their party's political, is very important. So this combination, I think, is critical. Having political and technical staff, a narrative that is national in nature, gaining the championship of the current authorities, but making sure that the process will go beyond the current government.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Leonardo. And I feel like you touched upon a number of the points we heard in the video. I mean, one guy at the end spoke about some of the challenges of frequent political turnover. And as you're saying, that delicate balance that must be struck between falling in love with the solution and also not holding it so tightly that it's affiliated or identified, right, with that particular individual or party. Luis, I'd love to turn to you to jump in here.
Sure. I think the question was phrased in terms of what are the kinds of people that you typically deploy or need at different stages of implementation or scale up. And I would say it's always the same people. The types of people don't vary. What varies is how intensely they are involved. So you typically need people who are advocacy experts, political economy experts, or kind of consensus building experts. And I think Leonardo expressed it very well when he said some people are going to be opposed, and maybe it's a little bit strong to use a word like neutralized, but yeah, sometimes you do need to neutralize those that are opposed to the idea, and so you need those skills, and you need those skills typically more at the beginning and at the end rather than in the middle. You need people who are good project managers. I mean, that the stuff takes logistics and coordination, and you have different actors involved. They all need to be coordinated. That's stronger in the middle. And then you need also people who are pedagogical experts or experts in the subject matter. And there was a good example from that Tanzania, Kenya, and Zambia example about the teaching of math. Obviously, you need those people involved, kind of the subject matter experts, and those need to be involved probably more at the beginning and in the middle than toward the end. And two quick things to add is that it's not just beginning, middle, and end. There's a pre-beginning, and the projects that I find that are most sustained and scaled are the ones that do a good job with the pre-beginning, which is actually figuring out what it is that the government or the country needs. Not, you know, the saying, when you have a hammer in your hand, everything looks like a nail. Well, that's not a good approach. You don't want your innovation to be the hammer. You want your innovation to be addressed at the fact that there are nails that are sticking out and need to be hammered in or fixed. So there's a pre-beginning and then there's a post-end. Namely, you don't want the innovation to just be a branded thing that gets added on to what the government does, but part of how the government regularly does things. And that requires that there's a post-end, if you will. Lastly, the best champions are the ones that you don't engage, are the ones that engage you. So being in the middle of things and understanding and getting picked out by people who are the champions that want to solve a problem rather than you picking them is not always possible, but it may be a good way to frame things, letting people identify you rather than you identifying them. That's what I would say.
Thank you, Luis, and so helpful how you sort of talked about the sequencing of these various actors. It reminds me of one of our colleagues who was supposed to be with us today, Larry Cooley, who often says we need to fall in love with the problem, not the solution. And as you rightly say, to dedicate enough time on the front end to really understand the needs, as well as on the back end to ensure it becomes just the new normal in the way of working, which I think those two bookends often get shortchanged. But Tricia, would love to bring you into this conversation. Could you share your thoughts as well?
Yeah, sure. So I think what's so interesting about the projects examples that we just heard on the video is that they're applied research projects that are trying to do research to support scaling. And if I think about normal applied research projects, they'll probably include a stakeholder mapping exercise at some point to think through who are all the relevant actors and institutions, the relationships among them, the power dynamics that connect them around the situation, the problem and the solutions that we're looking at. However, sometimes that can be kind of a static stakeholder mapping, just sort of a here and now. When it comes to scaling research, that stakeholder mapping needs to anticipate change because scaling is all about change. So it needs to be prospective more than just sort of static. And I think that example from ChemFed that we heard about was quite an interesting example because ChemFed actually developed and implemented that learner guide program that Anna Sawaki was talking about. And so they developed all kinds of stakeholder relations around their role as the implementer. But even so, when they started their scaling research, they did a whole new stakeholder mapping exercise to think through who would become the stakeholders as the initiative would scale and how it would be integrated then into the government systems. And that required a different set and a wider set of people and agencies. And it differed in Tanzania compared to the other countries in which it was going to be changed and adapted and contextualized to see how it would fit in those country contexts as well. When I think about this point about not everybody is a champion or an ally, and what do we do about critique and resistance? I actually think that one of the recent publications from this initiative from Brookings was really helpful in just talking about teachers and thinking about the different teachers that are involved. For instance, at the pilot level, maybe there are some teachers who are involved as the original early adopters, people who actually really embrace the opportunity to try something new. And then as things expand and impact is increasing, there's a need to engage a much broader set of teachers whose realities are different, who maybe were not supported through the scaffolding of the pilot initiative, but are being asked to implement a new thing in their regular work. And maybe the quality of the implementation from the point of view of the early adopters is not as good. But this is an opportunity to learn, not to see people as resistors so much as folks that we can really learn from to understand what are the points of resistance? What does that come from? What are the institutional inertias and the other competing demands that need to be acknowledged and respected, and then see how this innovation can actually really work in the real world? And then maybe just this point about how the actors that need to be engaged evolve over time. And I think this takes us back to scaling as a journey. And that journey has a destination that actually unfolds over time. Because today we're talking about what we understand as optimal scale for this initiative at this moment. But that will change as contexts change, maybe as our understandings and our appreciation of different equity needs devolves. So maybe today's idea of what is optimal scale is at a particular point, but 2 years from now, we actually realize that impact could be improved in a new way by growing that impact in a different set. So that new mindset of scaling will require a new look at the stakeholder mapping exercises.
That's great. Thank you so much, Tricia. And thanks for reminding us just this dynamic nature of scaling and how important it is, and also how challenging it is to infuse that sort of adaptability throughout. I'd love to turn back to you, Leonardo, taking advantage of your former hat of sitting in policy, as you said, as a former Minister of Education in Costa Rica, among other roles. I'd love if you have any thoughts about what scaling teams can do to really think about effectively engaging with government, as you said, at various levels, at the highest level, but perhaps at the technocrat and other levels. Any sort of insights there for us?
Maybe two or three very, very short points. One is that you have to identify a problem that is felt as a real problem by the educational community and by the government. You cannot just come from outside and give them a problem, or worse, give them a solution to a problem they are not feeling as their own. So the ownership aspect is very important. And this requires a narrative. And this narrative has to be developed with the educational community, with the teachers, with the students, with the families, so that it becomes embedded in the social contract of the country. It's not something that comes from outside. It does not come from the ministry. It's something that the educational community is feeling very much embedded with. The second, very much related to this, has to do with communications. Sometimes in government or in politics, people are reluctant. And as a former colleague in the government said, he told me, I don't waste my time with journalists. I have too much to do. I have to work. And no, I would say communicate, communicate, and communicate. It is essential that what you're trying to do is really understood by the people at the different levels, by the teachers, by the technical staff. That's completely essential. And not just to communicate like in a neutral way, or you have to understand that educational systems are, as the word say, systems, but they are also systems of power. There are a very complex structure of power, respect, privilege, and so you have to understand how your innovation affects that system of power within the educational system, so that you can really both take advantage of it, recognize the merits, make your champions at the different levels of the ministry participate in the reform, but as I said at the beginning, how to win over, and I know the word neutralize sounded bad, but believe me, you will need to neutralize some people or some aspects of your ministry. So basically what I would end up saying is that this is both a technical and a political issue. And many times when you're in government, people think that the word politics is like a bad word and that we should be very technical about our reforms. If you don't understand that politics is about politics, then you will not be successful. But if you don't understand that politics needs a good technical solution, you're also wrong. So mixing those two aspects of a scaling up as a technical and a political process is essential, and communications are critical for the success that we want to have.
Wonderful. Thank you, Leonardo. Well, I could go on with asking you all questions, but I want to leave time for our audience to jump in. So I am going to open it up now, turn it over to you, Nico. Could you share a question and then I can direct it to our panelists for responses? Thanks.
Yes, sure thing, Jenny. So we have two questions that are on engaging champions and stakeholders. One from Daniel Olivier. I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing your name, and Stephen Cleese. Daniel was mentioning that Diego from the Ceibal Foundation in the video talked about monitoring and evaluation boards and engaging actors in the educational ecosystem, teachers, families, and authorities that allowed them to have immediate dissemination of project results. So Daniel would like some more information on how to use these kinds of M&E boards. And then Stephen was talking about teacher unions and seeing them as potential major resistors and how we can engage them as partners in government. So just a little bit about stakeholders and champions.
Great, thanks, Nika. Maybe I'll start with you, Luis, and then Tricia, and then turn back to you, Leonardo. But if you want to respond, I know you might not be able to speak specifically to the example of the Monitoring, Evaluation, and Learning Board, but maybe this idea of bringing together diverse stakeholders around the table to really be involved in the co-design, implementation, and dissemination of results. And then anything you might want to say about teacher unions as well as being potential allies in this work. So Luis, over to you, please. Oh, you're on mute, Luis.
Thank you. Let me take the last question first. I don't think one can speak about teacher unions as monoliths. You have to differentiate the rank and file from the leadership. And sometimes the rank and file think differently from what the leadership think. And, you know, to go back to some of Leonardo's points, you need to be, and also Tricia around political mapping, you need to be astute about the fact that A, there may be more than one union, B, like I said, the rank and file may think very differently from the leadership, and so on. And, you know, I can use another example that's not a union, but to talk about raw power. And let's say that your innovation discovers a way or promotes a way to produce textbooks that are less expensive than what the textbook monopsonists, and is frequently a cartel of textbook producers, wants to sell expensive textbooks. You have an innovation that shows how to produce them for cheaper, but reduces their profit margin. You're going to get persecuted. You know, that they're not going to be happy. And so figuring out how to engage, you know, kind of a popular or people's level point of view to work on less expensive textbooks that goes against the interests of the textbook monopsony, that might be, or monopolists rather, that might be an issue. So yeah, you have to be astute. You have to do the political mapping, not just in terms of actors, but differentiating within the actors. Like I said, the leadership from the rank and file, and so on. Great,
thanks, Luis. Tricia?
Yeah, maybe I'll take then the points about stakeholder engagement. And what I really appreciated about what we heard from the videos, and Diego was talking about this, about being structured, about how you were communicating and connecting in with different stakeholders. So we talked about this focal point in the ministry who helped define what kind of research would be most helpful. And then that multi-stakeholder monitoring and evaluation learning committee that informed the project's adaptive management approach. And then, of course, in the CAMFED example, you've got the scaling advisory committee. So all of these projects in very different ways are trying to think about what are the mechanisms that they could put together to bring people together, to create bridges sometimes among stakeholders who wouldn't otherwise be talking, to decrease the distance between research and research users. And then sometimes those people became so involved that they actually started co-creating the research with the research teams. So I'm not sure that it's a matter of just defining the type of committee or the particular process that should be replicated everywhere, but figuring out in the context of these different initiatives, what will work best to have a multi-stakeholder group actually inform the work as it's going. I think one of the kind of interesting things to think about too is not just what can you create as a scaling initiative or as an applied research project to support what you're trying to do, but where do your stakeholders already gather and deliberate? And can you go join them as opposed to inviting them to join you in a project-specific type of committee? And then the final thing I think is that we need to figure out how to build research processes and these types of scaling processes that make it really clear about how the stakeholder input is actually adapting the initiative as it's going forward, to really show the value of participating, because we ask people to be involved in a lot of different committees and people are very busy. So it's got to be very clear to them about why their input matters and how you're using it and how you're adapting, for instance, the research to respond to what you're hearing from them.
Wonderful, thanks. Leonardo?
Yes, a couple of things. One, with respect to teachers, we need to learn how to engage them. They are in an almost impossible situation. We ask them to transform education, but to do it in very difficult conditions. We ask them to change, but change for them might be scary. We tell them something, and we've been saying this for, I don't know, 50, 60, 70 years, to go from rote teaching by memory and all those things to an active learner-centered pedagogy. But they might perceive this as something that reduces their power in the classroom, their authority, and they are scared, so that they keep reproducing the old ways of teaching. And this is becoming even more worrisome for them with the digital technology and artificial intelligence. So suddenly they feel that they are not respected. So one thing I'd say is we need to find in this different sorts of transformations, and while scaling them up, what are the new sources of authority and respect for teachers, so that they really feel that this is their project. That is one thing. And the second thing I would say, that I was going to say it before, Brad mentioned it, we sometimes think that we can plan these reforms in a very orderly fashion, and we have like if I have to use a musical analogy, we think that politics is like classical music, that we have the score from the beginning, that everything that will happen is written and it will go on. Politics is very much more like jazz. You have a general idea of what you want to do, where you want to live, how it should sound, and then you improvise as things go changing in the process. And that's the way in which you know how to do with teachers, you know what to do with your curriculum division, but that capacity to change as the process evolves, I think, is critical for the success of scaling up these processes. At the end, it will not look like your first draft, but the impact, as Brad said, the impact has to be there.
Thanks, Leonardo. I love that. I like the jazz analogy. That's great. Nika, I know we have just maybe a few minutes left. Do you want to share maybe one or two other questions? And then I might ask our panelists if you all might want to just take a minute to respond to what you heard, or respond to each other, just any sort of final concluding thoughts. Nika?
Yeah, sure. And I just want to start by saying I am so sorry to Stephen. I misrepresented his question about unions. And so I just want to note that he did not mean the resistors comment. But just as a final question, we are from an anonymous attendee. They are asking, what is the timeline of the scaling dynamic, given the challenges of government and partner cycles of planning and investment?
Great. All right. Well, why don't I go in reverse this time? I will do Trisha, Luis, Leonardo. If you want to have any sort of final thoughts in general or responses to that question, that would be great.
Well, I'm not sure that I would be able to answer, about how long, what's the timeline, because we're always defining the next steps, right? In an optimal scaling approach, and it's a set of arguments that we're making based on evidence, based on context, but what would be the next step toward improved impact? And then the scaling mindset, it takes us into, well, how would you get there? So I'm not sure that I can answer a question like that in terms of overall time frame. But I think maybe what I would say is this issue about adaptive management is a thing I think that can really serve us well in thinking about this type of research. And I see that the projects that we're funding include a whole lot of iterative, adaptive, cyclical approaches in their research. They're often built as one cycle needs to be done before you can inform what the next cycle is going to do. So there, in fact, can't be an overall blueprint and a score that we're following. It needs a a lot of adaptation and iteration. And so I think in this case, we really need to understand the adaptive management approach that's needed for scaling to not just be you adapt when plans don't work out as you thought they would. In fact, you're planning to be adaptive, and you're actually building that in to how you're approaching research and how you're approaching action.
Wonderful. Thank you, Luis.
Sure. I guess that the issue of time depends on how complex it is. And if you're talking about reform and getting kids to learn better, everything from reading and math in every subject in every grade, K through 12, that's a 10-year, 20-year reform, or might take that long to actually bear fruit, if not to design. If you're talking about a fairly simple innovation, like maybe a financial innovation of, giving each school a little bit of a budget that they can make some of their own decisions with, and it's decentralized down to the school level so that they can buy their own small materials and so on, and you do it on a formula basis, that could take 1 or 2 years to get results that people are happy with. And then, scaling it and getting it routinized might take another 3. So I've never seen anything worth doing that takes less than 1 year to bear results and maybe 3 or 5 to scale, all the way up to 10. So it just, there's no one answer. It depends on the complexity. And from the simplest, 1 to 5 years to the most complex, 3 to 20, is what I would say. I can't hear you. You might be muted.
You're mute.
Yeah.
Oh, apologies. Thanks. No, I appreciate that, Luis. No definitive answer, but long-term in nature might be fair to say. Leonardo, some final thoughts.
Let me add one quick thing.
Yeah, please.
I do think any reform needs to figure out how to have some quick wins. So, even if it's just a part of your reform, scoring a few quick wins are really important. Is really important. So, I would build that into your sense of scale. Even if it's a really complex thing, get some quick wins.
Great point. Thank you. Leonardo, final thoughts.
Final thought. Okay, I'll start with Luis' comment on quick wins. You do need quick wins, but and you will have also defeats. So let me put that in a much long-term perspective. Something that I learned when I was minister, because you do things that 2 or 3 years later, another government changes and you feel like it was a complete failure and you did nothing. And what you really learn is that, or at least what I learned, is that in education, there are like 2 main positions about education. There is one position that understands education as the way to train into obedience. And there is another view, which is understanding education as a way to create autonomy in people. And those are the really conflicting views. And what I see is that there are long cycles of that. For example, and let me use an example from a movie some of you might remember, Inherit the Wind, when in the early 20s, a teacher in a school is trying to teach evolution instead of creationism. And they have this whole conflict. Well, in many places, we won that fight in the 20s and 30s. And suddenly we feel that we are now in the same fight, and we see books being forbidden. We see, I don't know, teachers teaching that the earth is flat. So that distinction between obedience and autonomy will come and go. And what gives me a sense of optimism is that we always come back to this fight. And it doesn't matter if all the reforms that you did get lost in the next 5 or 10 years. What you did will come back with another person and another process. Like when you were there, you learned from the guys that did it, or the girls, the women that did it in the 20s and the 30s. So we have to look at education from a very long-term perspective to be able to be optimistic, especially in these times.
Thank you, Leonardo. Appreciate you ending on that note of optimism. We are unfortunately at time. I feel like we just scratched the surface, but so grateful to each one of you for sharing really those sort of, rich nuggets of insights. I am now going to hand it over to Brad and panel number 2. And to start that off, we'll begin with another set of videos from our KIX ROSIE scaling teams. And these videos and the conversation that will follow will be about maximizing data use, about scaling for government education decision-making. So thank you all again to panel 1 and look forward to ongoing conversations.
Hi there, my name is Renaud Combat. One element that worked really well for the Data Must Speak Positive Deviance research has been the use of Ministries of Education administrative data set, that is their EMIS data, their examination data, or any other data set that they may have. And it worked particularly well because Ministries of Education spend tons of money every year to collect data and high quality data from every single school in a country. And some of these countries are even innovating by using CAPI devices such as tablets or electronic devices to collect these yearly data points. The Data Must Speak team co-created this research from the outset with Ministries of Education, high-level but also technical folks, as well as development partners and unions. And leveraging existing data sets allowed those stakeholders to better understand the potential and the value of this data. It's not always just about descriptive statistics, but it can also be about econometrics to find valuable and policy-relevant findings. They are empowered to continue to collect this data every year, but they also put an extra effort to make sure that the data collected is of high quality. But most importantly, using administrative data sets allows for a greater ownership of the country and of the ministry that we work with for this research. It is their data, it is their findings, and it is their action that's going to transform this research into action. So why not leveraging those administrative data sets more often, not only scale positive deviant behaviors and practices found as part of the Data Must Speak research, but to also think through optimal scale of other innovations and programs that work within a context and within a country.
Scaling education innovation often targets national adoption, but our experience suggests that engaging local decision makers can be a powerful driver for success. For instance, a regional director of the Kenya ICT Authority, the agency responsible for managing content on National Digital Literacy Program, was initially skeptical about our blended TPD and early literacy software. After he learned about the research-based approach that we were taking, the director saw potential in the program and he became our supporter. He permitted the installation of the ABRA program on selected school servers and allocated in-kind support to the project. His team underwent extensive training, produced a troubleshooting guide, co-facilitated TPD session, and actively supported ABRA implementation. Positive impacts on teacher practice and students' learning impressed this director, and he arranged a meeting of our team with the national senior ICTA staff. As a result of this meeting, a bilateral MOU is being currently formalized. We feel that the engagement of local decision makers can be effective for 4 reasons. 1, they are aware of the needs on the ground and the potential an innovation can offer to bridge the gaps. 2, since they are dealing with a manageable set of schools, they have an ability to support the implementation. 3, evidence-based innovation can help them to become trailblazers by offering them data to back up their decision. And finally, they are driven by the desire to make a difference in their community, and the success they achieve locally can help make the case nationally.
Nuestro proyecto es esencialmente sobre la producción y uso de información sobre aprendizajes fundamentales en el sur global, y por lo tanto hemos tenido múltiples desafíos y éxitos con respecto al uso de datos. En particular, uno de ellos ha sido la dificultad de combinar las dimensiones global y local en el proyecto. Nosotros entendemos que producir información de aprendizajes fundamentales comparable entre distintos contextos es clave para entender no solo cómo los aprendizajes pueden ser distintos, sino también cómo los factores que influencian ese aprendizaje pueden serlo. Pero a la vez, en muchos casos, la producción de información comparable ha ido un poco en contra de producir información que sea localmente más relevante. Entender Este balance delicado desde el principio del proceso nos ha permitido anticipar esta dificultad en el proyecto y hemos podido sortearlo con éxito debido a nuestra intención explícita de referenciar nuestra intención de producir información comparable en documentos globales como el marco de proficiencia global y también en el proceso del proyecto de asegurar validez local y una validación por parte de equipos en cada país en los que trabajamos de la relevancia de nuestros procesos e instrumentos.
One of the challenges we noted regarding data and data use in our project was in relation to the administrators. Early in our discussion with the administrators about scaling, we asked about the elements that they would find necessary to scale an innovation. One of those elements that they mentioned was high quality data. Later, as we re-engaged them in discussions about scaling, we encouraged them to outline that scaling pathway by which an innovation would be developed and then taken up into the system. Interestingly, we noted that data was not featured in that innovation scaling pathway. This implies that there's a bit of a disconnect between what administrators feel they should do, what they want to do, and the actual practices of the Ministry of Education. It also suggests that administrators would need more support and more capacity building so that they could create new processes to integrate data into their decision making. For instance, this would look like identifying key points in the innovation scaling pathway where data would be necessary, the kind of data that they would find useful, and perhaps how that data could be presented.
Great. Thanks, everyone. I'm happy to moderate this second panel. As you heard from those videos, we're going to focus on the relationship between data use and engaging government for national level government education decision making. I am going to ask the panelists to turn their cameras on as I introduce them. I'm also going to remind you all as attendees, if you'd like to ask a question, please put it in the Q&A. I know that we can't get to all of them, but we'll certainly try our best. We're joined by Gustavo Arcia, who's an economic consultant in the field of global education. Gustavo, nice to see you. We're joined by Luis Crouch. Again, thank you for joining us, Luis, a retired emeritus senior economist at RTI International. We're also joined by Ian McPherson, a senior education specialist and team leader for the KIX project at GPE. And we had planned to be joined by Chikondana Musa, the permanent secretary of the Ministry of Education at Malawi, but I don't see her on this. I know that she's been having some technical difficulties, so she may join us during this panel. We'll have to see. I certainly hope so, because I have a feeling she's got a lot of interesting perspectives to share. I'm going to start by I'm going to ask a different question to each of you, and then we'll just turn this into a bit of a conversation. I'm going to start with you, Gustavo. As we heard, there's a real priority placed on scaling teams using data in order to bring government decision makers on board for scaling. Given your experience, how can data experts and government officials work together effectively to bring the right data to government decision makers? What do you think is needed from each side?
Well, this is a great question because it was addressed by Renaud Combat, by Angel Kaglin, and by Maina Wajoko in different ways. Let's talk about the issue of collection and use of quality data. Data of good quality, it sounds obvious, but it means that we have to make the effort to verify the data and to start collecting information that we can use for feedback for the innovation and feedback for decision makers at the local level and for feedback to national level for accountability and for informing decision makers about the nature and the progress of the innovation. Administrative data, for example, is a great source, as Renaud Comba said, and we should take advantage of it, but always make sure that it is of good quality the way that Angel described it. And also, it has to make sense at the local level, as Maina suggested. In the issue of data quality, we have to understand that from the point of view of the innovation for the clients and for the schools, data will make a difference for the quality of the policy decision. It will make a difference in the way you manage personnel, who is going to be in charge of implementing the innovation at different levels. Luis referred to the pre, mid, and post. Well, that's what it is. Who is going to take care of what? And data is going to be keeping track of that personnel. And data also is going to be important for budget management. In all this group, we don't talk about money, but money talks. And so we have to make sure that the innovation has a corresponding impact on the budget, and we have to manage it properly for making sure that the innovation is implemented properly and for accountability. In terms of the using the data wisely for the innovation will not sell itself. There is a political aspect to it, but also there is a data aspect to it. And decision makers are not going to react to very complex data presentations. I have no idea about any ministry who reacted to a two-stage least square regression, but they understand to intuitively obvious problems that are in the field and that you're using data to show how an innovation can help alleviate those problems, all solve it. So selling it to high-level decision makers or selling it to teachers or to the teachers union, you have to use data wisely, simplify it, make it intuitively obvious. And finally, I will say that you will never forget that in the end, I think Leonardo mentioned it, if it's not in the classroom, if it's not in the school, it doesn't exist. So you have to make sure that the data is linked to the local impacts so that the local impact can pace themselves and they also can serve the information they need to go upward to decision makers to keep track for accountability, political and technical, how the innovation is going.
Thank you. Gustavo, I want to ask a little bit of a follow-up. I want to know what you think about Angel's comment that in the case of their initiative, the government asked for data and then the data never showed up in the ultimate work, and that sometimes there's a disconnect here. Have you seen that? And do you have any thoughts on either why it's happening or how to address it?
Yes, in fact, one of my pet peeves professionally is that schools are asked to provide information to feed into the beast of IMIS, the Education Management Information System. But many times we forget to send the information back to schools so they can see how they are doing. They can see how they are doing with respect to their neighbors. And in the case of innovation, this is extremely important. So there could be a mirror, kind of a distant mirror that the schools see, how are we doing? We are providing data, should come back to us. That's something we can use. And that way we can use data wisely at the local level and at the national level.
Yeah, thank you. You know, it's interesting. It reminds me, one of the things that we found in the complementary research that we've been doing is that sometimes government decision makers will use data in particular ways to align with what they already want to do. And so when they say they need more data, that sometimes seems to be a way of saying, we want an excuse not to do this. Or if they say they're pleased to have the data, it can sometimes mean that they're pleased to have data that supports what they already wanted to do. And so I think about how to dig a little bit more deeply into the relationship of having data and using data. So thank you for that, Gustavo. Luis, I'd like to turn to you now and ask a slightly different question. These scaling teams, these KIX ROSIE scaling teams are implementers and they're researchers, and sometimes they include former or current government partners. Sometimes they're connected to universities. So a scaling team is a really kind of deep group. To what extent should scaling teams focus on engaging national level government decision makers? And to what extent should they spend their efforts more on local and regional government officials? And how do you explain that?
I think it needs to be both, unfortunately, because that means more work. But it really, truly needs to be both. If you don't engage, and it goes back to some of the issues that were talked about in panel 1 about the phase of the innovation. But if you don't engage with the local people, the regional or circuit or district directors and so on, and the people who work there, you won't know what they're capable of. When it comes time to design something, you might over-design something that's just too complicated for the local capacity, and you didn't take it into account, and therefore you don't have a proper capacity building plan. Or even if you have a proper capacity building plan, or you think it's proper, you know, you're trying to get the local level to use some really complicated econometric thing when they don't literally have never used Excel. So, you know, there's a lack of compatibility between the policy design and what people are actually capable of doing. Also, they may have different priorities. I mean, the most obvious one is districts or regions might care, ideally, about inequality within their district, but they don't care that much about inequality between districts by definition. But the national level cares about inequality or differences or whatever it may be between regions or between districts. The districts cares about the local inequalities. And so those are different priorities. And unless we respect those, we're going to design the wrong things. And I think the more interesting one that I actually hadn't focused on when we were talking about these the panels preparing for it is what the colleague, forget his name, from the Arkan Foundation brought up, is that if your innovation is useful and practical and it really gives results at the local level, those people become advocates up toward the national level. On the other hand, if you don't engage the national level, your innovation probably won't scale or won't sustain, because as we were saying before, it's to the degree that innovations get formulated into routine policy and into just the way things are done by a government. That's what sustains them. That's what scales them, and that requires national level involvement in, you know, making sure that the new innovation finds its way into curricular statements, into policies and procedures that become routine, that no longer even have a brand. You know, it's great, for example, that Data Must Speak has a brand, but what you really want is the Data Must Speak sensibilities and approaches to become part of the government through their own routine systems. So yeah, that's what I would say is unfortunately, because it needs a lot more work, you have to use both levels, local and national, and at different phases of the innovation.
Great. Yeah, that's helpful. And thank you. I think that those are two good examples. We had Renaud talking about the power of partnering with the central level government and this notion of ownership. And then we had Maina talking about 4 different reasons why bringing regional and local government officials into the sort of data loop is useful. And I'm reminded that what doesn't always happen is a set of communication and decision-making structures that actually connect and move up and down that sort of vertical hierarchy. And as you point out, each level has got its own commitments and its own constituencies. And so this is partly why it gets messy. Yeah, thank you very much. Ian, I'd love to turn to you now and ask a different question that's related to these topics. Ian, presuming that we all want to strengthen and increase the use of good data and research in government decision-making, how do you recommend that countries and bilateral and multilateral partnerships go about this?
Thank you very much, Brad. Can I check that you can hear me okay?
Yes.
Great. Thank you, Brad, and greetings to everybody. I'd like to make two initial points, and first is a reflection on the need for data, and by way of how much and how badly data is needed. As an example, the latest GPE results report for 2023 indicates that most of the 89 GPE partner countries lack data to monitor learning. And almost no country with data available is actually on track to meet their national targets in maths and reading. And we also observe that data reporting to UIS has been declining for the last 5 years, since 2018. But more precisely, 75 out of the 89 partner countries do not have enough data to monitor progress in math and reading towards the goals of GPE 2025, which is GPE's strategic plan. So data availability, in the first instance, is therefore a major concern that all parties, whether it's at national or global level, have a commitment to support. Countries need systems and approaches to collecting data, and international organizations should be supporting effective and efficient data collection and strengthening the capacity of policymakers to use it. And just to add as a side note that GPE considers functioning data systems as one of the 4 enabling factors or conditions of success that provide the chance for effective sector planning in practice. The second point that I wanted to reflect on is to note the difference between data use and research use. As we've heard, data is made available and accessible through data systems and is used for management processes, resource allocation, and evidence generation, while research or evidence is used for inclusive policy dialogue, advocacy, prioritization, implementation, and accountability, among others. So the point that data, data availability, data use, and research or evidence are different, and research and evidence can be based on administrative data. And these differences involve different power dynamics and different stakeholders. And linked to this, I'd like to reflect within this point a little bit more broadly about research. And you may well be familiar, and colleagues kind of joining this session will be aware that the OECD published in the last 18 months 2 reports on using education research in policy and practice. And what they found is that there are a range of barriers that limit the use of research by policymakers. And these include a lack of relevant research, a lack of financing, the generally low quality of research, a lack of relationships between different actors involved in research and its use, including, significantly, limited trust between policymakers and researchers, who often do not share the same understanding of education research and its use. And finally, a lack of mechanisms that facilitate the use of research. Similarly, education.org released a white paper a few years ago that argued that what policymakers want is research that is written for decision makers, not researchers, analysis that is forward-looking, not backwards, studies that match government priorities, not donors, sources that they can trust without vested interests, sources covering real-world frontline contributions, especially from their own country or region, partnerships with researchers and practitioners with research of Ministry of Education needs and greater reciprocity. And finally, channels to hear what practitioners are working on, how they are progressing, and how they are learning. So KIX as an initiative, the Knowledge and Innovation Exchange, which is implemented by the International Development Research Center, is driven by a set of principles within which lies the recognition that data and evidence are not neutral, facts are not self-evident, and their generation and, moreover, use are political processes that are infused with power dynamics. And in its efforts to strengthen the culture of evidence use, which is what I think Luis was talking about in terms of sensibilities and approaches just now, KIX emphasizes that the production of research and its use should be driven by those closest to the issues, supported by international organizations, but led by governments and institutions based in the South, working closely together as those at the center of policy dialogue and decision-making. And here, I would like to name check IDRC, and in particular, their Research Quality Plus framework. The RQ Plus framework informs the design of applied research projects with a simple but completely critical consideration, which is positioning research for use. This formula has informed IDRC's oversight of research that is supported by KIX, including how research co-constructed between researchers, whether national or international, and government greatly increases relevance and the likelihood of informing policy. This is akin to the pre-beginning that Luis mentioned earlier and speaks to the idea of falling in love with a problem that Jenny invoked when she was channeling Larry Cooley earlier. So an important additional point here is that countries come first. Issues at national level come first, and international organizations are in their service. It is not the other way around.
Thank you, Ian. Yeah, certainly there's a lot there. And I think you kind of pointed out some of the challenges and also suggested some of the potential solutions. It's nice to hear. One of the things that we found from the recent complementary research that we did with Rosie and that came out in a report a few months ago is just the multidimensionality of what it means to use both data and research in decision making, and that there are issues around access. There are issues around the politics of data use. Sometimes countries don't want to see or share data if it reveals inequities in their location, and so sometimes it's external groups that might actually play a useful role in the ability to shine lights on particular dimensions, but those external groups may have their own agendas as well. I think, as you point out, if we're not careful, a lot of the research becomes inaccessible and not very focused on concrete use, and therefore too easy to dismiss. And then I also think that we've got a long history of not always using research in decision making. And so this is a cultural change and it's a mindset change as much as it's sort of a technical practice. So I want to thank you for sharing those things. I would like now to suggest that maybe we turn to some Q&A. Nika, do we have some questions that we can ask the panel?
Yeah, sure. Certainly. There's been a lot of really great questions, and I apologize that we don't have time to talk about it. We have a question from Charlotte Jones here. The point about data only flowing upwards from schools and schools not being able to experience the benefit of data really resonates. Does the panel have any specific bright spot examples where this trend has been bucked, i.e. contexts or countries where schools or even district officials have been able to benefit from good EMIS or data systems?
Yes, I did a lot of work in autonomy, school autonomy, and also school accountability. And they used to Luis mentioned about the ability of some schools to control their budget to do minor purchases. The issue there is that flowing from the bottom to the top is the assignations of the budget for management and operations of schools. So at the local level, they know, with the collaboration with school councils and parents, what is the best use for the little budget they control. At the national level, they can see whether the operations, the budget for operations and management is meeting adequately the needs of different areas. It also helps you when you connect the data collected at the local level, fed into the IMIS, the issues of equality. And no matter how benevolent you use the data, there will be always areas where inputs are more expensive, and you have to do a lot of work in figuring out equity in terms of access to school materials in different areas. And that's where local information can be crucial to make changes at the district, provincial, and national level.
Ian or Luis, would you like to share anything?
Sure, if I may, Ian, sorry, not to barge in front of you. Actually, I think the successes that I have seen are even more radical in a sense than getting the data up and then back down, because even with the best technology in the world and the best, most timely reporting, when the data go up to the ministry and get sent back down, that's too long of a loop that can affect policy, but not management. And the best successes that I've seen is when the data that go up are merely a byproduct of local use of the data. So I think the example that Gustavo gave was a good one. Is for instance, when you empower schools to have their own little budget so that they don't have to requisition every box of chalk, every box of notebook paper, every box of pencils, but indeed get a little per capita driven budget so that they can buy their own purchases. And then they report back on what they spent on. That flow upwards of data as a byproduct of decisions that were made locally already, of course, with some accountability and some supervision, that's the best, is when it doesn't even have to go up and then back down. It just gets used locally. Again, a good example would be a lot of the projects that have succeeded in improving foundational learning. It's when the district or the learning officers or teacher support or teacher coaches at the very local level, they have a roster of schools that they visit. Maybe it's 20 every 2 months or something. And they themselves are keeping track of which schools are doing better. And then they direct extra support to the teachers that need extra help. And so they're actually using data locally. They're not sending the data up and then having the ministry say, oh, that school needs help, and send a message back down, that school needs help, go help them. It's the district level is empowered to make those decisions using data, using approaches that maybe were designed nationally, but they're using the data locally. And then they send reports. And that's really the best case. Not simply sending data back down, but just using it locally.
Yeah, I think it's a really important question, and I'm happy to say that several of the KIX ROSIE teams have engaged in some very innovative ways. And it's not only about whether the data goes down to up, but how it does so. And so, for example, the SAHE project and the DMS project are both really focused on sharing their data with schools. I also think about the St. Lucia project. You heard Angel speak, and what they're focused on, and I also think of Schools 2030 here, is how teachers can engage in action research to create their own data around the innovations that they're developing and iterating and refining. And then the actual scaling of the innovation becomes a teacher-based focus where teachers create and then begin to share data on effective pedagogical processes, and that culture of teacher-based research is scaled itself. And I think there is some real promise there. Before we move on to the next question, Ian, would you like to say anything?
Not on this point. I think Gustavo and Luis have given some good examples, as have you, but your mention of Schools 2030 makes me reflect on another point. But if there's time, I'd like to just give a quick reflection on, I guess, the plethora of international or internationally driven evidence support mechanisms and initiatives. But if you'll allow me 1 minute, I'm happy to make that comment, or if you want to respond to other audience questions, I'm happy to see that as well.
We have 1 minute. We can take another question, or we can offer you, Ian, the opportunity to share what you'd like to share, or we can split the difference. And if you could say it quickly, and then we'll take a quick question.
Okay, I'll be quick. Really building on that point is that there is an increasing number of global and regional platforms and networks and initiatives, such as AKF Schools 2030, FCDO's What Works Hub in Global Education, USAID's Shares Program, and this proliferation over the last few years is driven by a set of competing interests and risks leading to duplications of efforts and, moreover, confusion for countries. So the point here is that a recommendation for global organizations is the need to coordinate and, where possible, to collaborate. That will be in the interests of countries. I also just wanted to say that commensurately, And as we heard in the videos, is the need not only for international initiatives to strengthen capacity for data systems and data use at national level, but actively seek to promote the co-construction of research. This is what we heard in the videos. Government policymakers shaping evidence needs and research instruments and being involved in data collection increases ownership and use of findings in decision-making. Contextualization is therefore a minimum. It is the active engagement by countries that is the force multiplier for impact.
Great, thank you. So I think we're going to have to be quick with this last question, but maybe we can at least surface it. Nika?
Sure. We have a couple questions on what does scaling impact truly mean, and how to kind of bridge that that misunderstanding between research and data and evidence with decision makers.
Okay, are those two separate questions?
Yes, I tried to put them I've tried to put them together, but in terms of, what is scaling impact, we could go with that one.
Okay, Gustavo?
Yeah, I would like to add the second part of the question. I think extremely important at the local and mid-level and national levels to start understanding that by having a judicious management of data, presenting data with quality, allows you in the long game of innovations to start getting into the mind of decision makers and to the difference between evidence and opinion, between analysis and opinion. Data allows us to give clear evidence what is working and at what level. And instead of just saying, well, I don't think it works. That way we can protect ourselves from ourselves. So that is very important.
Luis, would you like the final word?
Just super quickly, I'm not sure I quite understood the question, but my sense is that we in terms of the international community, but countries are relatively pretty good at using data for policy and research and setting long-range plans and resource allocation to some degree, maybe not quite. The relative weakness that I see in most countries is, and it refers back to what I was talking about before, is the sort of localized use of data for improving day-to-day management. Systems like Data Must Speak, not just for improving the equity of financial allocations, but improving how the money is actually used at the local level. That latter bit is where I think we need to focus attention in empowering the local level, the district level, the school level, and using the data to better manage day to day. I think we're doing better, relatively better, in terms of the big policy pictures, the plans, the policy designs, and we need to shore up the use of data at the local level. And there have been some good initiatives here to do that, but we need to push, I think, a little harder on that.
Right, we're moving forward, but we're certainly not there yet. And I think, in ROSIE, we've spent a lot of time thinking about both of these questions. What does scaling impact actually look like? And what are all of these complexities around data and research use? I hope that some of you have read most of our things, and I hope that most of you have read some of our things, but we do have some recent ROSIE reports that take on exactly these issues. What does scaling impact look like? And all of the complexities around data use and research for scaling. Thank you all so much. We're just about to finish, and I know that it's been an awful lot over these last, hour and a half, hour and 45 minutes. And in some ways, we covered a lot of ground, and in other ways, I feel like we're just beginning. I'm going to turn things over to Rebecca Winthrop, who's the director of the Center for Universal Education, and ask that she offer perhaps some sort of closing observations, and then she's going to turn it over to Tracy Olson, who's going to say goodbye to us.
Thank you very much, Brad. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Great. Thank you, Brad. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, all the panelists.
This is an incredibly rich conversation. And one of the things that I have been reflecting on, and I have copious notes here, and I'll try to, my task is to summarize this very rich conversation. But one of the things I've been reflecting on throughout the panels and the 2 sets of videos is how far we have come as an education community. It was approximately 8 years ago that we launched our Millions Learning initiative on scaling, and we did it because we had peers at Brookings looking at scaling in other sectors, and we found when we did a big literature review that only 16 out of, I think it was 170 or so, research papers and journal articles and reports on scaling in low and middle income countries were on education. And so we knew relatively little. And at the time, we made great headway, I think, and it became a more important topic in the global education community, with many others coming in and adding their insight and voices. And one of what I've been reflecting on is how the level of discussion and debate and insight and the things we know is so much more nuanced now than it was 8 years ago. So I, like Leonardo, am optimistic. We have a long way to go, but in general, I'm very heartened by the progress. And I am in no way going to attempt to summarize incredibly rich, incredibly nuanced, incredibly detailed insights from all of our contributions, but I take away three main things. The first one is around what are we talking about here? The what, and this idea of scaling as an effort of transformation, and not transformation at a micro level, but at a macro level, an effort of scaling as transforming systems. And that very last question of like, what do we exactly mean as scaling impact? I go back to how Brad talked about it at the beginning, and I think it was very insightful, and it's this idea of carefully and thoughtfully embedding a promising innovation so it can last over time and ultimately transform a system so it changes how education is delivered and it changes the ultimate experience of the end user, which is the learner. So, I think that is an important concept. A lot of discussion is swirling about over the last couple of years on system transformation. We've certainly been working on it at Brookings, and I think it's very helpful, that contribution. I think within that, a couple of things that stood out to me were this idea of if whatever you're scaling doesn't shift the instructional core, sometimes people call it the pedagogical core, the teaching and learning experience of that end user of education, which is the learner and the students. If your innovation doesn't reach there, it doesn't exist, which is a nice quote from Leonardo. I think that is an important thing to keep in mind when we think about system transformation. I also think something that stood out to me was this idea that you need to think of equity as transversal, not only in the intervention itself, but in the scaling process itself. I think I'll come back to that in a minute, because I think a lot of the discussion, particularly around data, has implications for how we think about equity. And then sort of lastly, on this first point of scaling as transforming systems, this idea that often we go awry or wrong or misstep when we miscalculate the multiple dimensions within systems. And I think that actually really set up very nicely a lot of the contributions of the panel. And the second thing that I really took away was about how to perhaps deal with the multiple dimensions of systems if the instructional core is really at the center and you have many other levels from that, from that first graphic that Brad showed, thinking about layers and systems. So the second thing is really around, how could you not go awry and miscalculate those many different levels? And multiple people talked about getting a shared vision of what we're doing. Leonardo, you win the gold medal in terms of the panelists with the most quotable bumper sticker sayings. And you talked a lot about narrative, and that the process is of building a shared narrative is much less like classical music and more like jazz. So for me, a lot of what the panelists talked about is, to build sort of this shared buy-in and narrative and ownership, you need to involve stakeholders at all levels, from teachers on up to the political level, but be careful you don't involve the political level. Don't hold them too tightly so they own it totally in case they get out of office. But you need to involve members at all levels. I think one stakeholder that did not get a lot of attention is parents and communities. I've certainly found in our research on innovations in the past that if you don't involve parents and communities, they too can push back on innovations if you haven't appropriately shared and brought them in. So you involve, you listen to them, and really listen, as in think through what their issues are with the innovation you're trying to scale and how it needs to be adapted and what concerns they have and how to tweak it. You adapt. And it's an ongoing process of adaptation, and you kind of rinse and repeat and do that forever. As Tricia said, it's an ongoing process of adaptation. And I think that was really important. And I think the third thing that came out for me was sort of within that process of building a strong narrative and ownership across multiple levels and being able to do true adaptation, communication is essential. And we often give it short shrift. It's seen as separate PR, marketing, or something, but really real communication, sharing what communication expertise, skills, giving the time to share what you're thinking, what you're doing, getting feedback. And that also goes very much to thinking about data use, communication between multiple decision levels around the data that you have, that you need, that how you want to use it, etc. And the last sort of takeaway I have was particularly around, I think, both the first and second panel, but I was thinking particularly the second panel around power. That was a big theme that came out. Who has access to information and data? Who gets to use it? Who can contribute to it? That is really what I think a lot of the second panel was talking about when it was talking about data use and systems for that. And to me, that also very much is a partial answer to this question of how you have to think of equity considerations in the process of scaling itself, in the process of embedding an innovation in a system. So those are my sort of big reflections for myself. I'm sure you have many of your own. And I want to just give a big shout out to KIX, to GPE, because there is more of this to come. GPE has continued the Knowledge and Innovation Exchange initiative for several more years. So that is exciting. And it is, I would say, on a serious note, ever more important. I'm very glad that GPE has done that. Because we are going to need this type of thinking, this type of, we've heard multiple times, mindset, the scaling mindset. We are going to need this, we're going to need the jazz mindset, sort of disciplined adaptation to solving problems ever more in the world we have today and the world we have in the future. COVID-19 was a massive disruption, and there are many, many more to come with climate change, with mass scale people movement, refugees, etc., around the globe. I don't need to name them all. So this is really, really important work for our sector as a whole. It's work that we are not only doing in this initiative, in this project, with all our wonderful team members who you've heard from, but it's also work that we are taking across our center. We had our 20th anniversary last year, and we have a new 10-year strategy, and a big part of it is to really focus on creating a movement network around the knowing doing gap, which is all about this idea of disciplined adaptation and connecting data and research to use and practice, and doing so in a way that's co-creative with other civil society like-minded peers around the globe. So thank you very much. It's very inspiring. And to close, I will hand over to Tracy Olson to just wrap us up and close us out. Thank you.
Thanks, Rebecca. And thank you all so much for attending. We hope you'll reach out to offer your feedback, thoughts, and share your own work with us. This really is a global community. We also want to thank several Brookings operations teams who have supported this work over time and are supporting this event today. We appreciate your hard work. As for the future, we at Millions Learning here at Brookings are currently finishing up a set of ROSIE research briefs, one on scaling goals and pathways, one on prioritizing equity, one on research and scaling, and one on engaging champions. Be on the lookout for those in early January. The Global Partnership for Education has extended the KIX initiative until 2027, and so ROSIE will continue for the next few years in some shape or another, to focus on research, capacity strengthening, and knowledge mobilization around scaling the impact of promising education innovations in low and middle income countries. So stay tuned for more scaling research, exchange, and support in the months and years to come. Take care and enjoy.